On a snow-laden Christmas Eve in Philadelphia, Edmund Hawthorne stood at the entrance of the harvest table, his broad shoulders dusted with fresh powder, his heart weighted with something far heavier than the winter cold. The 38-year-old father had not been on a date in 4 years. Not since the night his wife Rebecca had left this world in a Christmas accident that still haunted his dreams. The wind carried the sound of carols from a nearby shop, and each note felt like a small blade against his resolve. He had promised his daughter he would try, had looked into her hopeful brown eyes that morning, and nodded when she asked if he was really going to meet someone special. Now standing in the doorway with snowflakes melting on his worn jacket, he wondered if he had the courage to step inside. Inside the warmly lit restaurant, a beautiful woman sat waiting. Her posture elegant but guarded, her fingers wrapped around a wine glass she had barely touched. Natalie Pierce, 35, 6 months pregnant and quietly devastated by her own past, glanced at her watch with barely concealed impatience. She had agreed to this evening against her better judgment, had let her friend convince her that it was time, that 4 years was long enough to mourn a future that never came. But sitting in this restaurant, decorated with garlands and twinkling lights, surrounded by couples leaning close over candlelight, she felt only the familiar ache of disappointment mixed with something sharper, something closer to dread. The blind date was failing before it had truly begun. Edmund fumbled his words, spoke of home repairs and his daughter's ballet recitals, his nervousness manifesting in gestures too large, laughter too quick. Natalie offered polite smiles that never reached her hazel eyes, answered questions about her work with the practiced brevity of someone who had learned to keep the world at arm's length. And then from behind a potted fir tree decorated with silver ribbons, a small voice whispered the words that would change everything. Charlotte Hawthorne, 8 years old with dark curly hair, tugged her father's sleeve and looked up at the distant woman across the table. "Papa," she breathed, her brown eyes bright with a certainty no adult could explain. "She's the one." Edmund Hawthorne had the kind of face that told stories without words. His features were kind, weathered by late nights and early mornings, by single parenthood and the weight of loss. His black hair held streaks of premature gray at the temples, and his hands, rough from carpentry work and home renovations, were the hands of a man who had rebuilt his life from broken pieces. He had once been a civil engineer, brilliant and promising. But when Rebecca died, he could not bear the corporate world anymore. He needed to be home for Charlotte, needed to walk her to school, needed to be there when she woke from nightmares. So he became a contractor, fixing roofs and foundations, earning just enough to keep their small house warm and their small world intact. His daughter was his entire universe, a thoughtful girl with her mother's smile and a wisdom that sometimes frightened him. Charlotte carried a worn ballet slipper charm everywhere, a gift from Rebecca in her final days, and she spoke with the clear-eyed honesty of children who have seen sadness too young. Natalie Pierce occupied a different world entirely. She was a senior creative director at one of Philadelphia's most respected advertising agencies, a woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated six-figure campaigns with cool precision. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, professionally styled, and she dressed in tailored coats and silk scarves that spoke of success hard-won. But beneath the polished exterior lived a woman who no longer believed in fairy tales. 8 years earlier, she had lost her younger brother in a drowning accident, a grief that had carved out a hollow place in her chest. And just 4 years ago, on the eve of what should have been the happiest day of her life, her fiancé had confessed to an affair with her closest friend. The wedding had been canceled, the venue emptied, and Natalie had locked her heart behind walls of professional ambition and calculated distance. She had agreed to this blind date only because her colleague had begged, insisted, promised it would be different. But sitting across from this gentle, awkward man who smelled of sawdust and spoke of his daughter with reverence, Natalie felt only the familiar ache of disappointment. Her hand unconsciously moved to rest on her rounded belly, a reminder of the complicated joy and fear she carried. This pregnancy, from a brief relationship that had ended badly 6 months ago, was both a blessing and a burden she was learning to navigate alone. The restaurant glowed with amber light. Garlands of evergreen draped along the walls, candles flickering on white tablecloths. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent curtains, blanketing Walnut Street in a hush that felt almost sacred. Edmund tried to make conversation, asked about her work, her interests, but every sentence seemed to fall flat. He knocked over his water glass when he reached for the breadbasket, and the resulting puddle spread across the table like a metaphor for his nervousness. Natalie dabbed at it with her napkin, offered a tight smile, and Edmund felt the evening slipping away like melting snow. What Edmund did not know was that Charlotte had wandered closer to their table, her small face pressed between the branches of the decorative tree, watching. The little girl studied Natalie with the intensity of someone reading a story only she could see. She noticed the way Natalie's fingers kept returning to a silver bracelet at her wrist, a delicate chain holding a tiny compass charm. She saw how Natalie's eyes grew distant when Edmund mentioned Christmas traditions, how her breath caught just slightly, as though she were swallowing pain. Charlotte recognized that look. She saw it in her father's eyes every December, the shadow that passed over his face when carols played in grocery stores, the way he held his coffee cup a little tighter when neighbors spoke of family gatherings. Natalie's compass bracelet had been a gift from her younger brother, Daniel, purchased at a street fair during a December years ago when the world still felt safe. Daniel had loved adventure, had dreamed of sailing, had believed in finding his way through any storm. When Daniel died, Natalie found the bracelet in his room and had worn it ever since, a quiet mourning she carried against her skin. She touched it now unconsciously as Edmund spoke of his wife's love for winter, how Rebecca had made hot cocoa from scratch every year and filled their home with the scent of peppermint. The coincidence pressed against Natalie's carefully constructed composure like a crack in ice. Edmund noticed the bracelet, too. Noticed the sudden moisture in Natalie's eyes before she blinked it away. He wanted to ask, wanted to reach across the table and offer comfort for whatever grief he had accidentally touched. But before he could find the words, Natalie stood abruptly, excused herself to the restroom, and Edmund watched her walk away, her spine straight, her steps measured despite her condition. He dropped his head into his hands, certain he had ruined everything. It was Charlotte who appeared then, sliding into Natalie's empty chair with her charm clutched in her hand. Edmund looked up, startled. "Sweetheart, you're supposed to be at the kids' table with the coloring books." "She's sad like you, Papa," Charlotte said simply. "I can tell." Outside, the snow intensified, wind picking up. The weather service warnings Edmund had ignored earlier now proving prophetic. The storm that had been predicted as minor was strengthening, and the temperature was dropping fast. Inside the harvest table, the first signs of trouble began with a flicker of the overhead lights, then a gust of wind that rattled the windows hard enough to draw nervous glances from other diners. When Natalie returned to the table, her makeup carefully restored, she found Charlotte sitting in her seat, small hands folded as though waiting for a grown-up conversation. "Your bracelet is pretty," Charlotte said, her voice gentle. "My mama had one like it. She's in heaven now." Natalie's breath stopped. She looked at the child, really looked, and saw the same hollow ache she carried mirrored in eyes too young to understand such loss. "I'm very sorry," Natalie whispered, lowering herself carefully into the chair beside Charlotte rather than across from her. "My little brother is in heaven too. He loved adventures." Edmund watched the exchange, something shifting in his chest. A door he had bolted shut 4 years ago began to crack open. The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dimmed. A waiter hurried past with an apologetic expression, murmuring about power fluctuations. Through the tall windows, the street outside had transformed into a wideout, visibility reduced to mere feet. Cars crawled along the avenue, their headlights diffused into useless halos. The restaurant manager appeared, hands raised to quiet the murmuring crowd, announcing that the city had issued travel warnings and that streets were closing due to rapid accumulation and black ice. Edmund immediately stood, his protective instincts overriding his awkwardness. "Charlotte, we need to get home before this gets worse." He looked at Natalie, apology written across his face. "I'm sorry. I need to get her somewhere safe. Natalie stood too, her professional facade slipping to reveal genuine concern. The buses have stopped running. I heard someone say the trains are delayed. How far do you live? 45-minute walk in good weather, Edmund admitted. With Charlotte in this storm, I don't know. Charlotte, seeming to sense the adult anxiety building, squeezed her father's hand. It's okay, Papa. We'll be okay. But the child's reassurance proved premature. As Edmund helped Charlotte into her coat, as Natalie gathered her own belongings, the little girl's attention was drawn to the window, to the swirling white world beyond. She had never seen snow fall so thick, had never watched it pile against glass in drifts that seemed to climb higher by the minute. Without thinking, entranced by the beauty and strangeness of it, Charlotte slipped away from her father's side and pushed through the restaurant's front door into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical force, stealing her breath, and she stumbled forward, her small boots immediately sinking into snow that reached past her knees. She wanted to turn back, but the door had closed behind her, and the wind was so loud she could not hear her own voice. Inside, Edmund turned to take Charlotte's hand and found empty air. His heart stopped. Charlotte, he spun, searching the immediate area. Then the color drained from his face. Charlotte. The word came out as a roar that silenced the restaurant. He lunged toward the door, Natalie right behind him, and they burst into the storm together. The wind sliced through clothing, the snow so thick it obscured the street, the buildings, everything. Edmund's voice cracked as he called his daughter's name, panic stripping away every careful control he had built over 4 years of single fatherhood. This was his nightmare, the one that woke him gasping at 2 in the morning, the terror that he would lose her the way he had lost Rebecca, that he would fail the one person who needed him most. Natalie, shivering in her wool coat that was elegant but utterly inadequate for a blizzard, saw the raw fear in Edmund's face and made a decision. She would not leave him alone in this. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called for Charlotte, too, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind, one hand protectively cradling her belly. They moved together, checking behind cars, between storefronts, Edmund's hands shaking as he swept snow away from potential hiding spots. It was Natalie who spotted the small pink shape huddled against a parked vehicle in the restaurant's parking area, a tiny figure nearly buried in white. There, she pointed, and Edmund was already running, his boots slipping on ice, his body crashing to his knees beside his daughter. Charlotte was crying, her face red with cold, her teeth chattering so violently she could not speak. Edmund pulled her into his arms, wrapped his coat around her, used his own body to shield her from the wind. I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you. His voice broke on the words. Natalie arrived seconds later and without hesitation removed her own scarf and wrapped it around Charlotte's head and shoulders, then pressed herself against Edmund's back, adding her body as another barrier against the storm despite her condition. The three of them huddled there, strangers hours ago, now locked together in a fight against nature's fury. We can't stay out here, Natalie said, her lips nearly numb. We need to get back inside. Together, they struggled to their feet, Edmund carrying Charlotte, Natalie guiding them back toward the amber glow of the restaurant. They stumbled through the door and nearly collapsed, snow sliding off them in chunks, water pooling on the floor. Other patrons rushed forward with blankets, with towels, with hot drinks. The manager announced that no one would be leaving tonight, that the restaurant would serve as an emergency shelter until the storm passed or city services could reach them. Edmund sat in a corner booth, Charlotte wrapped in 3 blankets, her small body still trembling. He rubbed her arms, her back, whispered reassurances while his own heart hammered against his ribs. Natalie slid into the booth beside them, her hair plastered to her head, her expensive silk blouse ruined, her hands shaking from more than cold. She reached out and placed one hand on Charlotte's knee, a gesture of comfort that surprised even herself. You're very brave, Natalie told the little girl softly, braver than I've been in a long time. Charlotte looked up at her, brown eyes still wet with tears but clearing. You came to find me, too, she said. Just like Papa. Something passed between Edmund and Natalie then, an understanding that bypassed words. In that moment, in the chaos of the storm and the terror of nearly losing a child, the walls they had each built around themselves developed cracks. Edmund saw not the polished professional who had seemed so distant at dinner, but a woman who had run into a blizzard for a child she barely knew, despite being 6 months pregnant. Natalie saw not the awkward, grieving widower, but a father whose love was so fierce it bordered on holy. The restaurant settled into an uneasy vigil. Families clustered together, strangers shared tables, and the staff moved through the room offering what comfort they could. The power stabilized enough to keep the heat running, and someone found battery-powered lanterns that cast softer, kinder light than the overhead fluorescents. The golden glow transformed the restaurant into something timeless, a refuge suspended outside the normal flow of hours and obligations. It felt almost like a dream, this collection of people suspended between one moment and the next, waiting for the world outside to calm. Edmund could not stop looking at his daughter, could not stop touching her hair, her face, assuring himself she was truly safe. The fear had dredged up memories he fought daily to suppress. Memories of another winter night, of headlights sliding on ice, of the phone call that had ended his world. He had promised himself he would never let anything happen to Charlotte, had structured his entire life around keeping her safe, and tonight he had failed. The guilt sat heavy in his throat, a stone he could not swallow. Natalie watched him with something dangerously close to tenderness. She recognized the self-recrimination in his eyes, the way he seemed to fold into himself with each passing minute. She had carried that same weight after her brother died, had spent months replaying every decision, every moment, wondering if she could have changed the outcome. She wanted to tell him it was not his fault, that children were quick and unpredictable, that he had found Charlotte and brought her back, and that was what mattered. But the words felt inadequate, too small for the size of his fear. So instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The touch startled them both. Edmund looked down at their joined hands, then up at Natalie's face, and found there an echo of his own pain, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. "You lost someone at Christmas, too," he said quietly. It was not a question. Natalie nodded, her throat tight. "My brother. My wife," Edmund whispered. "For years. Car accident on Christmas Eve." He swallowed hard. "I thought tonight, maybe trying to move forward, maybe it was time. But I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to be anything other than Charlotte's father. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," Natalie confessed. "I built my whole life around being someone who doesn't need anyone, who can't be hurt again. And then I watched you run into that storm for your daughter, and I thought, maybe I've been wrong about what strength looks like." Charlotte, drowsy from warmth and exhaustion, murmured something neither adult caught at first. Natalie leaned closer. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "You're not scary anymore," Charlotte said sleepily. "You look like Mama when you smile at Papa." Natalie's eyes filled, and this time she did not try to hide it. Edmund's hand tightened around hers, and they sat there, two broken people beginning to believe against all odds that broken things could still fit together. But peace was fragile, and the night was not yet finished with them. Across the restaurant, near the bar where a few patrons had gathered to watch the storm through the large windows, a man stood watching Edmund and Natalie with narrowed eyes. Vincent Crawford had worked with Natalie for 6 years, had asked her to dinner a dozen times, had been refused each time with polite professionalism. He had seen her arrive at the restaurant tonight, had watched her blind date unfold from his own table in the corner, and he had felt the sting of rejection sharpen into something uglier when he saw the way she looked at the ordinary, plain-dressed contractor across from her. When the storm had trapped them all inside, Vincent had initially been pleased, thinking it gave him more time to position himself as the better choice, the more suitable companion. But watching Natalie tend to Edmund's child, seeing her hold Edmund's hand with a gentleness she had never shown him, Vincent felt his ego curdle into spite. He approached their table with a smile that did not reach his eyes, 2 cups of coffee in his hands as though offering kindness. "Natalie, I thought you might need this." He set 1 cup in front of her, then turned to Edmund with practiced condescension. Quite a night for a first date, isn't it? Though I suppose Natalie told you this was all part of the office community outreach program. Edmund blinked, confused. Community outreach program? Vincent widened his eyes in mock surprise. Oh, she didn't mention? We've been running this initiative at work, pairing executives with people from, well, different backgrounds. Corporate social responsibility, you know. He clapped Edmund on the shoulder with false camaraderie. I think it's wonderful what you're doing, participating. Not everyone would be comfortable being someone's good deed. The words landed like stones. Edmund's face went very still, his hand withdrawing from Natalie's as though burned. Natalie stared at Vincent with dawning horror, understanding immediately what he had done, what he was trying to do. That's not true, she said sharply. Vincent, that's a complete lie. But the damage was already taking root. Edmund stood, his movement stiff, his expression shuddered. It's fine, he said quietly. I should check on Charlotte. Except Charlotte was right there, looking between the adults with worried eyes, sensing something wrong. Edmund, please. Natalie stood too, reaching for him. He's lying. There's no community program. I agreed to this date because a friend set it up, because I thought maybe I was ready to try again. It's okay, Edmund repeated, and the emptiness in his voice was worse than anger. Thank you for helping with Charlotte. I appreciate it. He lifted his daughter into his arms, blankets and all, and moved to a different booth across the room, his back to Natalie, his shoulders rigid with hurt. Vincent smiled at Natalie's stricken face. I was just trying to help clarify things. No need to let misunderstandings drag on. Get away from me, Natalie said, her voice shaking with fury. You're a petty, cruel man, and you just hurt someone who's been through enough. I hurt someone. Vincent scoffed. You're the one slumming with the help, Natalie. I was doing you a favor, reminding you who you actually are. I know exactly who I am, Natalie said coldly. I'm someone who just realized she's been wasting years of her life working alongside people like you. She turned away from him, but her hands were trembling, her heart fractured by the look on Edmund's face, by the way he had retreated as though expecting rejection all along. The night stretched on, the storm outside showing no signs of weakening. Natalie sat alone at her table, watching Edmund across the room as he held Charlotte, rocking her gently, his face turned toward the window. She wanted to go to him, to explain, to somehow undo what Vincent had poisoned, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Charlotte, though, had different plans. The little girl was tired but not sleeping, and she had heard everything. She slipped from her father's arms when he dozed off for just a moment and padded across the restaurant in her sock feet until she stood in front of Natalie's table. You made Papa sad, Charlotte said, but there was no accusation in her voice, only observation. I didn't mean to, Natalie whispered. The man who said those things, he was lying. I didn't know tonight was going to be special. I just thought it was another disappointing evening. But then I met you, and I met your father, and everything changed. Charlotte studied her with those two wise eyes. Papa thinks nobody will ever love him again because Mama's gone. He thinks he's too broken. She climbed into the booth beside Natalie uninvited, her small hand finding Natalie's larger one. But you're broken too, aren't you? I can tell. And you still came to find me in the snow. Natalie's tears finally fell, silent and hot on her cold cheeks. I am broken. I've been broken for a very long time. Maybe broken people can fix each other, Charlotte said. Like when Papa fixes houses. Two broken pieces can make one whole thing. She leaned against Natalie's side, trusting and warm. I think you're the one. Even if Papa's too scared right now. Across the room, Edmund woke to find Charlotte gone and sat up in panic before spotting her with Natalie. His first instinct was to retrieve her, to maintain the distance that felt safer than hope. But watching his daughter curl against the woman who had run into a blizzard for her, watching Natalie hold Charlotte with such careful tenderness, Edmund felt the first crack in his resolve. The hours crept toward dawn, the storm finally beginning to lose its fury as the first gray light touched the sky. City snow plows rumbled past, their orange lights flashing through the windows, and the restaurant manager announced that streets were being cleared, that transit would resume within hours. People began to stir, gathering belongings, checking phones, making plans to return to their disrupted lives. Edmund approached Natalie's table slowly, Charlotte still asleep against her shoulder. "I should take her," he said quietly. Natalie looked up at him, her eyes red from crying, from exhaustion, from the weight of the night. "I'm not a charity case, and you're not mine," she said. What Vincent said, it was cruel and it was false. "I don't expect you to believe me, but I need you to know it's true." Edmund was silent for a long moment. Then he sat down across from her, careful not to wake Charlotte. "I want to believe you," he admitted. "But I've spent 4 years believing that what I had with Rebecca was once in a lifetime, that trying for anything else was foolish. And then tonight, for the first time, I felt something that wasn't just grief, and it terrified me." When Vincent said what he said, part of me was almost relieved because fear is easier than hope. "I know," Natalie said. "I know exactly what you mean. Because I felt it too. That terrifying possibility that maybe I could try again, that maybe you could see past all my defenses. And when you pulled away, I wanted to let you go, to prove to myself that I was right not to trust anyone." She placed her hand on her belly. "But then your daughter reminded me that being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the thing anyway. And I'm going to be a mother soon. I need to learn how to be brave again." "She's wise beyond her years," Edmund said with a sad smile. "She gets that from you," Natalie replied. She reached across the table, palm up, an offering. "I don't know what happens next. I don't know if we're too broken, too damaged, too scared. But I know I don't want to walk away without trying, without at least being honest. I haven't felt this much in 4 years, and yes, it hurts. But it also feels like maybe I'm still alive after all." Edmund looked at her hand, then at her face, and saw there a reflection of his own desperate hope. He placed his hand in hers, their fingers intertwining, and Charlotte stirred between them, murmuring something in her sleep that sounded like, "Told you so." The city outside was waking, white and clean under fresh snow. And inside the harvest table, 2 broken people held on to each other with the fragile strength of those who have decided to try again. By mid-morning, the streets were passable, and people began to depart. Edmund and Natalie stood in the restaurant's entrance, Charlotte bundled in her coat, holding her charm. The moment felt heavy with possibility, with all the things they had not yet said, all the fear they had not yet conquered. "Can I see you again?" Edmund asked, the words awkward but sincere. "Properly, I mean." "Yes," Natalie said, and her smile was the first real one he had seen from her. "I'd like that very much." Charlotte tugged on Natalie's coat. "Can you come to our house for Christmas? We make gingerbread houses. Papa's not very good at it, but I can teach you." Natalie knelt down to Charlotte's level, her hand resting on her belly. "I would be honored to make gingerbread houses with you." 3 days passed, days during which Edmund and Natalie texted carefully, spoke on the phone late at night when Charlotte was asleep, learned the contours of each other's grief and hope. They discovered small things, important things. Edmund learned that Natalie took her coffee with cream but loved hot chocolate with excessive marshmallows, that she had wanted to be a writer before ambition and heartbreak steered her toward corporate success. Natalie learned that Edmund sang off-key to classic rock songs when he cooked, that he kept a photograph of Rebecca in his wallet not out of inability to let go, but as a promise to never forget where he came from. They were careful with each other, tender, aware that what they were building was fragile and precious. And on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the storm, Natalie arrived at their small house carrying a bag of baking supplies and a heart that felt dangerously open. She had stood outside their home for 5 minutes, breathing in the cold air, steadying herself. This was the moment, she knew, when she would either step fully into the possibility of love again or retreat to the safety of solitude. She chose the former, chose courage, chose the chance to become whole. Edmund answered the door in a flour-dusted apron, and the house smelled of baking cookies, of cinnamon and vanilla and home. Charlotte squealed and launched herself at Natalie, who caught her with a laugh that startled them all with its joy, a sound so pure it seemed to fill every corner of the small space. Her belly was now rounded and full, the baby due in just weeks. They spent the evening building gingerbread houses, each one lopsided, each one imperfect, decorating them with candy and icing that dripped down the sides. The kitchen was modest, with worn countertops and cabinets that Edmund had refinished himself. It was nothing like the elegant kitchens Natalie had known in her childhood, in the homes of wealth and carefully curated beauty. It was better. When Charlotte fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in blankets and clutching her ballet slipper charm, Edmund and Natalie stood by the window watching snow begin to fall again, gentler this time, peaceful. "I've been so afraid," Edmund admitted. "Afraid that letting you in meant letting go of Rebecca, that I'd be betraying her memory. And now," Natalie asked gently, "now I think maybe she'd want me to be happy again, to give Charlotte a full life, to not spend the rest of my days just surviving." He turned to face Natalie, taking both her hands, his eyes dropping to her belly. "You make me want to live again, not just exist. And that's terrifying, but it's also the best thing I've felt in years. Both of you." Natalie leaned her forehead against his. "I spent so long thinking love was something that would destroy me again, that trusting anyone was just setting myself up for another betrayal. But with you, it feels different. It feels like maybe we can build something new out of all our broken pieces." "Charlotte was right," Edmund said with a soft laugh. "That first night when she said you were the one, I thought she was just a child making wishes. But she saw what I was too scared to see." The clock struck midnight, Christmas Day arriving with quiet certainty. Edmund cupped Natalie's face in his calloused hands and kissed her, gentle and reverent and full of promise. When they pulled apart, they found Charlotte sitting up on the couch, grinning sleepily. "I told you," the little girl said, supremely satisfied. "She's the one, Papa." Edmund laughed, a sound of pure happiness that Natalie felt in her chest like coming home. He pulled her close as Charlotte joined them at the window, the three of them silhouetted against the falling snow, Natalie's hand resting on the life growing inside her. Outside, the city sparkled with Christmas lights. But inside this small house, the real magic was quieter, deeper. A family was being born from grief and hope in equal measure, from two people brave enough to try again, from a child wise enough to see what adults tried to deny. The gingerbread houses stood on the kitchen counter, each one different, each one beautiful, each one a small miracle created with love and laughter, like a promise that broken things, given time and love and courage, could become whole again. And somewhere in the space between memory and tomorrow, Rebecca Hawthorne smiled, knowing her daughter would be loved, her husband would be happy, and the heart she had left behind had found room enough to hold both the past and the future without losing either one. If this story touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances are possible, even after the deepest grief. Love can bloom again in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the courage to try is all we need to find our way home.